Welcome to Economic Trends. In recent times, Russia and China have been considered to be close allies, but in reality, they are mortal enemies. In a meeting just weeks before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russian leader Putin and Chinese leader Xi Jinping declared their partnership as limitless. The Chinese have never condemned the Russians for any of their actions, and they have abstained on every critical vote in the United Nations. Senior Chinese officials have openly supported Russia's security concerns around NATO enlargement in Eastern Europe, while blaming the United States and NATO for supplying the Ukrainians with weapons and arms, dragging out the conflict. Meanwhile, Russia has been losing its ability to export oil and gas to Europe, but the Chinese have stepped in to take some of their place. Compared to a year ago, the Chinese are now buying 60% more of their energy resources from Russia, providing the Russian war machine with much-needed cash to continue fighting the war in Ukraine. Even before the Russians invaded Ukraine, Beijing and Moscow were growing increasingly closer together, and their relationship is shifting into something resembling a more formal military alliance. A Sino-Russian alliance in the 2020s makes perfect geopolitical sense in many ways, but it won't make much sense after a few more decades. Both Russia and China are authoritarian great powers who each wish to disrupt and change the status quo in Eurasia to their benefit. Russia's most important geopolitical policy for centuries has always been to control as much of the Eurasian steppe as possible. The Eurasian steppe is a huge flat plain that begins in northern Germany and steadily grows wider the further east it goes into Russia, to the point where it's thousands of kilometers across and almost impossible for any military to defend against hostile invaders. Throughout the Cold War, the Russians achieved their greatest territorial control over the Eurasian steppe in their history, extending their proxies in the Warsaw Pact all the way to Germany. However, following the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, Russia in its current form has watched as its once complete domination of the plain has eroded away. Germany reunified, every former Warsaw Pact country flipped to joining NATO, and even the three former Soviet Baltic republics all joined up with NATO. Belarus remained loyal to Moscow, and that meant that the red lines for Russia ultimately came in Ukraine and Georgia. It would place a NATO and American military presence directly along the Greater Caucasus Mountains, around which are flatter coastal strips that can be utilized by an invading army into the Eurasian steppe. Across from these mountains, and through the low, easy-to-pass-through coastal entrances, it's effectively nothing but flat land all the way to Moscow. Immediately across from the mountains is arguably Russia's most sensitive area, Chechnya, an ethnically and religiously distinct region that fought two brutal wars for independence from Russia across the 1990s that claimed the lives of tens of thousands. If you were ruling in Moscow, and you perceived that NATO could become a rival and potentially hostile military alliance in the future, and you had the long history of being invaded repeatedly by Western European armies from this direction, this situation would understandably make you pretty nervous. So, Russia invaded Georgia in 2008 and occupied about 20% of their territory, including Abkhazia, to plug up the western coastal entrance into the Eurasian steppe while keeping NATO at bay. Then they invaded Ukraine in 2014 to occupy Crimea and plug up that entrance into the Eurasian steppe from the Black Sea, while also preventing Ukraine from joining NATO. Finally, they invaded the rest of Ukraine in 2022 in an attempt to fully push their geographic defenses against NATO back to the gap between the Carpathian Mountains and the Black Sea opposite Romania. In 1860, China ceded a vast amount of land in outer Manchuria to Russia under duress, without a single shot fired. This land, which is now home to cities like Vladivostok and Khabarovsk, holds enormous strategic importance for Russia, as it is the home base of the Russian Pacific Fleet and nuclear-armed submarines. However, this treaty also locked China out of the Sea of Japan, limiting its access to the East and South China Seas. The Soviets insisted that the border was the banks of these rivers on the Chinese side, effectively implying that all of the islands within the rivers belonged to the Soviets in their entirety. Mao disagreed with this interpretation and insisted that the boundary ran through the midpoint of the rivers, meaning that islands on the Chinese side were in fact Chinese. The matter came to a boiling point in March of 1969 over an island the Chinese claimed on their side of the river as Xinbao, which the Soviets claimed within their river as Damansky. For weeks, hundreds of Chinese and Soviet troops battled against each other for control over the island, resulting in dozens of deaths on both sides and hundreds more wounded. The world's two biggest communist countries fired over 10,000 rounds of artillery at each other and were approaching the brink of full-scale nuclear war. The Soviet High Command at the time was terrified of a greater war with China. The Chinese had well over 1.5 million soldiers deployed near to their border with the Soviet Far East, compared to only 350,000 soldiers on the Soviet side. The big fear in Moscow was that Mao was preparing to retake Outer Manchuria, as he had made private comments effectively labeling the 1860 Russian annexation of Outer Manchuria as an unequal treaty. A few Soviet bureaucrats even argued that the only way to stop the vastly numerically superior Chinese forces from seizing the area would be by deploying nuclear weapons against them. Luckily, the crisis gradually died down, but the border remained theoretically in dispute between them all the way until it was formally demarcated in 1991. However, this does not guarantee that they will always legally agree on it, especially from the perspective of paranoid planners in the Kremlin. After all, Russia agreed on the internationally recognized borders with Ukraine through multiple treaties in 1994 and 1997, only to then renege on those treaties based on their supposed historical claims to Ukrainian territories like Crimea and the Donbas. Russia invaded and conquered large swaths of Ukrainian territory based on their supposed historical claims to those territories, which opens up the possibility of China hypothetically doing the same thing with their historical claims to Outer Manchuria in the distant future. China's rapid economic growth and massive population have put a strain on its natural resources, especially its freshwater supply. The majority of China's freshwater resources are located in the south, in the Himalayan regions of India, Nepal, and Bhutan, which already have adversarial relationships with China. India has an even higher population than China and will also face acute water shortages this century. China has been eyeing the massive, easily accessible, and underutilized freshwater resources in Lake Baikal, the largest lake on the planet. In the 2010s, a Chinese state-owned company called Aquasib began buying up land around the lake's perimeter and announced plans to construct a pipeline from it to China, which sparked angry protests from the local Russian population. The Russian government stepped in and shut down the whole thing. But as climate change continues to reduce water supplies for hundreds of millions of people in China's arid North Plain, and as China's economy demands more energy inputs, China's interest in the vast water and energy resources in the Russian Far East will inevitably continue to grow. The Russian Far East is as resource-rich as China is poor, and it is sparsely populated, in stark contrast to China's densely populated regions. The Far East's population has been steadily shrinking, and Putin's Russia has been left with little other choice but to begin opening up the Far East to Chinese investment and labor, which has long been resisted in Russia over fears of becoming demographically dominated by the numerically superior Chinese. However, the more Russia has to rely on China for capital and labor to develop resources in the Far East, the more it is forced into becoming China's junior partner on the world stage. China would like to keep Putin's regime in power in the Kremlin because they're giving Beijing everything they want right now. But if that ever stops in the future, all bets are suddenly off. China's interest in Lake Baikal is a reflection of its growing water and energy anxieties, and it is a clear indication of where China's priorities lie. While China and Russia share a common enemy in the United States, if that ever changes, they are far more predisposed to being rivals than friends. Please don't forget to subscribe and enable notifications for future information about global economics and business.